In 1414, the Council of Constance was held to end the Western Schism, which saw a couple of popes exist at the same time. And it was a huge event which saw officials from all over Europe, the Middle East, and even Ethiopia arrive. But to avoid further divisions, they divided Europe up into 4 Latin nations: English, French, German, and Italian, and later Spanish was also added as a nation, and all other states and nations within Europe were just lumped together in with one of these. For instance, the Polish-Hungarians, Bohemians, and Scandinavians were all just lumped together with the Germans, and each nation was given 1 vote. But this came at a time when nationalism was sort of growing in Europe. For instance, Lorraine was considered part of Germany, but the people there spoke French, and this confused and angered many of the French writers. And many historians began connecting their nation with an ancient tribe or people. For instance, the German writers often said that they were Teutons and could trace their lineage back to the German-speaking Adam and Eve. And the British and French both claimed to be of Trojan stock, etc., etc., etc. Well, at the Council of Basel in the middle of the 15th century, the Swedish took issue that the Spanish were given 1 vote while claiming to be the descendants of the Visigoths. And that's because Nicholas Ragvaldi said that the Swedes were the true descendants of the Goths. So nobody really knows where the Goths came from originally, maybe Sweden or Germany or Poland, we just don't know. But from there they began to settle all over Europe, moving as far south as Croatia, Ukraine, and Spain. But the Swedes began saying that they were definitely Swedish and came from Gotland, and the name alone backs this up. And other writers, like the brothers Johannes and Aulus Magnus, then said that they'd managed to trace the Swedish royalty back to the Geats, and then from the Geats back to the Goths that sacked Rome. And there might have been a very good political reason as to why all these writers started emerging at the same time. This came shortly after the Swedish Liberation War that saw Sweden break away from the Kalmar Union. Now, this theory continued for some time. For instance, in the late 17th century there was Olaus Rudbeck, and he was quite an interesting character because at the front of his book Atlantica he portrayed himself next to Plato, Aristotle, and the likes. Now, he also said that the Swedes were the Goths, but he also said Swedish was the language of Adam and Eve, and he also said that Sweden was Atlantis and the cradle of civilization. So for a long time in the early modern period, the Swedes saw themselves as the descendants of the Goths and therefore an ancient civilization. But what's interesting here is that they saw the Goths for a long time as being a little bit democratic, so they thought that Sweden should also be a little bit democratic. And this was particularly important during the Age of Liberty here in the 18th century. But unfortunately for this theory, at least, it eventually waned after the Viking revival kicked off in the 19th century and people began to focus on their Nordic past.